I'm Evelyn Whitaker, 72 years old, and this morning, my own daughter stood in my living room and said the words that would change everything. You'll be out of here by morning. Mother, the house is sold? She didn't flinch when she said it. Not even a pause. Just those cold, hard words sitting in the air between us, like dust that wouldn't settle across the room. Brent. Her husband leaned against the arm of my couch, like he'd just won something. His eyes scanned the wallpaper, the mantel, the floors, like he was measuring what he thought was already his. I sat still, hands folded in my lap. Not because I agreed, but because I refused to give them the satisfaction of seeing me shake. What they didn't know was that the moment they showed their cards, I had already decided I wasn't playing by their rules. Before I go any further, let me know where you're listening from in the comments and hit that like and subscribe button if you've ever had to stand your ground when the people closest to you tried to take what was yours. I was born and raised in Savannah, Georgia, back when milk came in glass bottles and neighbors actually knew each other. My parents weren't wealthy, but they believed in two things: working hard and keeping your word. My father ran a small repair shop downtown. My mother taught piano in the front room of our house, with the windows open even in the heat. So music spilled onto the porch. Those values never left me. Not when I met Richard, not when we bought this land with a folded newspaper listing, and certainly not when we built this house. One stone at a time, with our own hands. Richard worked double shifts, laying tile during the day and fixing plumbing on the weekends. We planted roses out back before the walls were even up. And by the time Lauren was born, the house already felt like it had roots of its own, deep and solid and full of love. She learned to walk across these floorboards. She helped me bake cookies in this kitchen. She painted pictures of the willow tree out front with glitter and too much glue. I never imagined the same little girl who once begged me to read bedtime stories would grow into a woman who'd look at me like a burden. The change didn't happen all at once. At first, it was just fewer visits, then shorter phone calls. Then Brent came along, smooth polite, too polite if you ask me. And suddenly, everything shifted. She started referring to the house as the property, asked about its value, its size, what I planned to do with it, if anything ever happened to me. I should have known then what they were circling toward. But when you're a mother, you keep hoping you're wrong. You give the benefit of the doubt until it's too late. The first real sign came 2 weeks ago. Early morning fog was still clinging to the garden, and I was trimming back the frost-bitten lilies when I opened the mail and found a glossy brochure for St. Joseph's Assisted Living. I hadn't requested anything from them, didn't even know how they got my address. It had pictures of smiling nurses and tidy rooms with beige curtains, said things like peace of mind and round-the-clock care. I tossed it on the counter, told myself it was just junk mail. But a small knot started forming in my chest, and it never quite went away. 3 days later, Brent showed up at the house by himself, unannounced, stood in my kitchen with that thin smile of his, and said he was just checking in, said Lauren was worried about me, said maybe it was time to think about making life easier. He rubbed his hands together the whole time, like he was about to sell me something, said, I shouldn't be alone, said power of attorney was just a safety net, just paperwork, no real change, just protection. I didn't argue. I just listened, offered no tea, gave no answers. But as soon as he left, I drove straight to the bank and asked to speak with the manager. Mr. Collier had known me and Richard since before Lauren was born. When he pulled up my account, he hesitated, just a moment too long before saying everything looked fine. Then added quietly that someone had tried to access my information 2 days earlier with forged documents signed with my name. I didn't say much on the drive home, just stared out the windshield as the live oaks blurred past. I knew now that it wasn't just suspicion. It wasn't just distance or misunderstanding. They were planning something, and they were doing it fast. What they didn't realize is I'd already made a call of my own, and by the next morning, a name would be written on a legal folder sitting in my purse. One that would make sure they never laid a hand on this house again. But before any of that happened, they came back one more time, and this time, they weren't pretending to be kind. Brent didn't sit down. He stood there in the center of my living room, shifting his weight like he owned the floor under his feet. His voice was low and clipped the kind people use when they're done pretending to be polite. "I'm going to be very clear with you, Evelyn. You're making this harder than it needs to be." I stayed seated. The chair beneath me was firm, the kind with arms I could grip if I needed to. I didn't grip them. "Am I?" I said, not as a question. He paced a little, hands moving as he talked like he was building a case in his head. "You're not well. You're forgetting things, getting confused. You've isolated yourself. Even your own daughter's worried sick. We can't just stand by anymore while you," he hesitated, "while you spiral." I kept my voice calm. "And you think that's enough reason to take everything from me?" Brent didn't flinch. He walked over to the mantel and tapped one of the photo frames with his finger. "You're unfit to manage these assets, Evelyn. A court would see that. You could be declared incompetent and a conservatorship would be appointed to protect you. It's the responsible thing. Someone like Lauren and me, we'd handle everything on your behalf. It's not an attack. It's a safeguard." I let him talk. I wanted to hear how far he'd take it. He stood near the window now, the light from the overcast sky making the side of his face look even colder than usual. "You've already forged documents once," I said, quiet but clear. "You really think you'll get away with doing it again?" His jaw twitched just for a second, but he masked it with a scoff. "You can accuse all you want, Evelyn, but once this gets legal, everything changes. Your finances, your health records, your decisions, every little thing will be on display. The court won't care how long you've lived here or what flowers you planted. They'll care that you're vulnerable." I stood then, slowly letting my knees straighten one at a time. I wasn't tall, and I didn't try to be. I looked him in the eye, and just past his shoulder, I saw the tiny, blinking green light tucked in the corner above the bookshelf. The camera had been running since he walked in. "You're wrong about me, Brent," I said softly. "You think you're standing in front of a confused old woman, but I know exactly what's happening, and I'm ready for it." He stepped in closer, lowering his voice. "We can still handle this without a fight. Just sign over the house. Move into St. Joseph's. You'll be safe, comfortable. We'll take care of everything." I didn't move. "No addict will ever touch what I've built," I said. "Not now. Not ever." He didn't have anything left to say after that. For the first time since he'd arrived, he didn't look so sure of himself. I walked past him, slow and steady, and opened the front door. "We're done here," I said. "You may leave." He didn't argue. He looked around one last time at the walls, the ceiling, the photo on the side table, and then walked out without another word. The door closed behind him, and the quiet that followed felt heavier than the conversation. I turned back to the living room, walked to the small end table near the window, and knelt down. The camera light was still blinking. I reached behind it, popped out the SD card, and slid it into the little black case I'd bought the week before. My hands didn't tremble. I'd already decided I was done playing nice. I called Daniel. He answered right away. "Mrs. Whitaker, is everything okay?" He threatened court action, I said. Tried to paint me as mentally incompetent. He mentioned conservatorship, said they'd have me removed. There was a short pause on his end. "Was it verbal or written?" "Neither," I said. "It's on video." I could hear the shift in his voice right away. "You have him on camera. Clear audio and visual. No edits, no coercion, just him talking." "That's excellent, Evelyn," he said. That's very, very good. I'll get you a copy by tomorrow, I told him. Everything was recorded, every word. With that kind of evidence, he said their case falls apart before it even starts. If they try anything in court, we'll bury them. And if it escalates, we can file criminal charges for forgery and harassment. We hung up shortly after that. I stayed where I was for a while, looking at the photos on the bookshelf. Richard, in the garden. Lauren, as a little girl, the three of us, at a lake cabin up in Tennessee. You couldn't see the cracks in those pictures. You had to be there to know when things started to change. But tonight, I wasn't mourning the past. I wasn't even angry. I was ready. A week passed with no contact. I spent the time checking locks, updating my will, double-checking account statements. The house was quiet, but I stayed busy. Then, early one morning, I heard car doors slam outside. I walked to the front window and pulled the curtain back just enough to see. Lauren was there. Her voice was high and bright, the way people sound when they're trying too hard. A man in a tailored blazer walked beside her carrying a briefcase. Real estate agent by the look of him. Another man followed, a younger one with a clipboard and sunglasses, even though the sky was cloudy. Probably the investor. They were walking the yard like it already belonged to them. I didn't answer when they knocked. I stayed at the far end of the hallway where the camera had a full view and listened. Eventually, they let themselves in through the side sunroom using the key I'd given Lauren years ago. What they didn't realize was that the new locks on every main entry point meant they couldn't go beyond that room. I'd let them walk into a box and sealed the rest of the house behind them. They wandered for a while. I could hear Lauren pointing things out: the potential for a home office, the wide-open yard, the resale value. She used phrases like, just too much house for one person and easier to manage with fewer complications. It didn't surprise me. I stayed behind the hallway door until I heard the side door close again. No one knocked this time. No one called out a goodbye. They just left. That night, I sat at my desk with a small glass of water and opened one of the old photo albums. I hadn't looked at it in years. The pages were still thick, the paper still soft from handling. The first picture was always my favorite: Richard standing next to a stack of bricks with a hammer in one hand and his arm around my shoulders. It was taken the day we laid the foundation for this house. As I turned the pages, I could see it all so clearly. Lauren, as a toddler, Richard, pushing her in the tire swing, birthday cakes with too many candles, summer picnics where we let the grass grow long. And then, the later photos, holidays where Brent was in the background, always smiling, always quiet. The warmth started to fade. The laughter didn't quite reach the corners of their eyes anymore. By the time I reached the last page, I closed the book and sat back. I wasn't thinking about how we got here. I was thinking about what needed to happen next. The line had been drawn. Quietly. Carefully. And the next move would be mine. The day after they walked through my house like it was already theirs, I woke early. The light outside was soft, the kind that comes just before the sun has fully risen. I stood by the kitchen sink and watched the steam curl up from my coffee. The roses outside had started to open again, those pale, pink ones Richard planted the spring after Lauren was born. He always said they were slow to bloom, but never failed to return. By mid-morning, I was sitting across from Stephen Patel in his quiet office 2 blocks from the square. We hadn't spoken face-to-face in years, but he still remembered how Richard liked to round every number down and how I preferred to see the decimals. His desk was neat, just the way I remembered, with the same glass paperweight shaped like a lighthouse. I want every account reviewed, I told him, line by line. I need to know nothing's been touched. Stephen didn't ask why. He opened the files and began going through them with me page by page. Balances, dates, signatures. Every detail. Nothing had been moved, Nothing appeared off. He looked up after the last folder was closed. "You're locking it all down," he said. "How bad is this?" I met his eyes. They already tried forging my name. Stephen exhaled, sat back in his chair. "Then we'll flag everything. I'll set alerts on each account. If anyone even tries to move so much as a penny, you'll know." I nodded. "And if something does happen?" He didn't hesitate. "We'll freeze everything. On the spot." I stood to leave, gathering the paperwork. Stephen followed me to the door and paused before opening it. "If you need someone to testify," he said, "just say the word. You have every right to protect what's yours." That night, the air was cool enough to open the windows. I let the breeze move through the house while I sat in the study. The wind chimes Richard had hung under the porch eaves years ago made their soft sound like they always did when the weather turned. I didn't feel nervous, not anymore. I felt something else, something sharper, focused. 3 days later, Brent came back. I heard the doorbell and let it ring twice before opening it. He didn't waste time on pleasantries this time. No fake smile, no small talk. "We need to talk," he said. I stepped aside, let him in. He walked into the center of the room again, just like before, like it belonged to him. "We've done our part," he started. "We've tried to be reasonable." I didn't say anything. He turned to face me. "This ends today." I kept my arms at my sides. "Go ahead. I don't know what game you think you're playing," he said. "But you're not well, Evelyn. You've been making mistakes. There are people who can testify to that. Neighbors, bank staff. You're forgetting things, misplacing paperwork. We're not the only ones who've noticed." He was laying the groundwork, trying to build a case. I said nothing. "If we have to file," he went on, "we will. The court needs to know you're not capable of handling things on your own anymore. We're prepared to take this to the next level." I watched him as he spoke, steady and silent. When he finished, I walked over to the far corner shelf. The small green light blinked again. I bent down and switched off the camera, removed the SD card, and tucked it into my pocket. "Thank you, Brent," I said, quiet as ever. "You've been very clear." He didn't understand at first. His eyes narrowed. Clear about what I didn't answer. He left soon after, frustrated, storming out without slamming the door. Once he was gone, I called Daniel. I gave him the footage and told him everything that was said. He didn't speak for a moment after I finished. "We'll use it," he said. "It's exactly what we needed. Will it be enough?" He didn't hesitate. "It's more than enough." The days that followed passed quietly. I went about my routines, tending to the garden, folding laundry, making tea in the afternoon. I stayed in motion, but I never forgot that something had changed. The silence wasn't heavy anymore. It was steady. That weekend, I drove to a small cafe across town and sat by the window. I hadn't told anyone where I was going. I just needed a place where I could sit without watching the door. The couple at the next table were talking about paint colors for their new kitchen. The man behind the counter wiped down the pastry case like he'd done it 1,000 times. Outside, someone walked by with a yellow dog on a short leash. I sat there for nearly an hour. Then I went home. That evening, I opened the cabinet in the hallway and pulled out the folder I'd kept since Richard passed. Inside were copies of the deed, the will, the utility bills. Everything we'd ever signed together. I laid them out on the dining table one by one in order. Then I called Daniel again. "I want to move forward," I said. "Are you sure?" he asked. "I am. We scheduled a meeting for the next day. He said he'd handle everything." I believed him. Before bed that night, I stood on the back porch and looked out over the yard. The roses were still blooming, even the stubborn ones. The house was quiet. The wind chimes moved just enough to remind me I wasn't alone. The following week, the knock didn't come first. It was the sound of car doors, 3 of them closing one after another, like a sequence rehearsed. I was in the kitchen, rinsing out my tea mug, when I heard Lauren's voice outside. High-pitched. Too cheerful. "And here we are. You're going to love this place." I moved to the edge of the window where I could see without being seen. Lauren was walking up the stone path with a man in a gray blazer carrying a briefcase. The way he moved slow and assessing told me everything. Real estate. Behind him was a second man, stockier, younger, in sunglasses that didn't belong on a cloudy morning. He had the stance of someone used to calling the shots. An investor. I didn't move from the window. I let them knock. I let them wait. They tried the sunroom door. It opened. Lauren still had the old key. I had let that much remain. What she didn't realize was that the rest of the house, every other door, was now secured behind new locks and reinforced frames. The sunroom led nowhere. Their voices filtered in through the vents. I stood at the far end of the hallway where the camera above the sitting room had a full view. I didn't speak. I didn't interrupt. I just listened. "This space has great light," the investor said, his voice echoing slightly through the sunroom. "Right," Lauren answered too quickly. "It just needs some updating, but the layout is solid. You could open it up, turn it into something really clean and modern. My mother never used half of it." There was a pause, papers rustling, footsteps on tile. "The property line goes all the way to that back fence," she added. "It's more than most people get in this part of town. I heard the real estate agent now. This neighborhood holds value. Easy to flip, or if you're thinking longer term, you could rent to a younger couple. Once we get the paperwork in place, I'll put together a timeline." "That'd be great," Lauren replied. "We've been trying to simplify things for her. She really can't manage a place like this anymore." I stayed still back against the wall, just beside the hallway arch. My fingers rested at my sides, steady. They walked around the sunroom another 10 minutes, speaking low and laughing once or twice forced, like people pretending this was already done. Then I heard the side door open again. No more voices, no more footsteps. The car doors closed again, one after another. I stayed in place for a while longer, not because I felt afraid, just because I wanted the quiet to settle. Let them imagine the deal was already in motion. Let them believe the space was theirs. They'd written the ending in their heads. They just didn't know the story had already changed. That evening, I sat at the kitchen table with an old photo album. The one with the worn leather binding and the little fabric tie that used to wrap around it twice. The first photo was of Richard standing in front of a pile of bricks with a level in his hand. He was smiling, not the kind you give to cameras, but the real kind, the one he always wore when he had a project underway. We were just kids then. The yard was bare, nothing but dirt and wild grass. He used to say this house would outlive us both. The next few pages filled in fast. Lauren as a baby, her fingers tangled in Richard's work shirt. Me holding her under the willow tree in spring. A birthday cake on the porch. A winter morning with snow along the railing. Photos that still smelled faintly of the boxes they'd been stored in. By the time I reached the last pages, the changes showed in more than the faces. Lauren's smile got tighter. The visits became shorter. Brent started appearing in the background, then in the center, his arm around her shoulders, his hand on the back of her chair, always polite, always listening, but never far from the conversation. Even after Richard passed, I kept hoping for something to shift, for her to come back to me even a little. But the visits came only when she wanted to ask about the estate, about upkeep, about future plans. Not one conversation about how I was doing, just the business of getting older. I closed the album and sat still, hands on the table. The wind outside had picked up. The old wind chimes above the porch moved gently, making that soft sound they'd made for years. The sound Richard liked. He used to say it reminded him that even stillness had music in it. The next morning, I stood in the living room with the curtains drawn halfway open. The yard looked the same. The hedge needed trimming, and the hose had gotten kinked near the spout again. I reached for the phone and called Stephen. He answered on the second ring. "Evelyn, I want to do it," I said. "The trust. All of it." There was a pause. "You're sure I'm ready?" By that afternoon, we were sitting in his office again. No one else. Just a few folders, a notepad, and the same quiet as before. "We'll create a private, irrevocable trust," he explained. "Once it's filed, it cannot be undone. Your liquid assets, investments, insurance, everything goes under the trust. You remain the sole beneficiary as long as you live." I nodded. "And the house?" he asked. "I want it transferred into the trust as well. Out of my name. I stay as tenant for the rest of my life, but when I'm gone, it follows the trust's instructions." He leaned back slightly, studying me. "That removes any access. No contests, no probate court, no power of attorney games. They won't be able to reach it. That's what I want." He tapped his pen twice. "There'll be some paperwork. Property appraisals, legal transfer filings. But we can begin this week. I want it done quietly." He looked up. "It already is. I signed the first set of documents that day." Stephen handed me a copy in a slim folder. He said we'd have the trust's full protections in place before the week was over. Before I left his office, I made one more call. "Henry, it's Evelyn Whitaker." There was a pause on the other end. "Well, that's a voice I haven't heard in a while. I need to talk. I'm not selling my house, but I need it moved on paper. Privately. No listing, no family offers." Henry didn't ask why. He just said, "Come by the office tomorrow. I'll set it up." That night, I stood by the window and watched the porch light flicker on. The yard was quiet. No visitors, no cars in the driveway. The house had never looked more like itself. The next morning, I met Henry Ballard at his office just off Maple and 6th. It had been years since we last spoke in person. He looked a little older, but still had that quiet steadiness Richard always liked about him. He pulled out a chair for me and sat across the table, flipping open a legal folder as if we'd just picked up from the last time we did business. "I found someone," he said. "Private buyer. Trusted family friend. Keeps a low profile. No debt. No interest in the property itself beyond helping with the arrangement you mentioned." I nodded. "And the lease already drawn up. Lifetime tenancy, non-transferable, non-cancelable. They'll purchase the property through a holding LLC, and you'll stay exactly where you are for as long as you choose." He watched my face carefully. "It'll look like a sale on paper, but no one will move in. No one will show up. No one but you. That's exactly what I need." We reviewed the paperwork together. The appraised value of the home had already been logged from Stephen's side. The trust documents were aligned. All that remained were the signatures. Henry passed me the pen. "This isn't about revenge, is it?" he asked gently. "You're not leaving?" "No," I said. "I'm staying right here." The pen moved easily across the page. When I finished signing, Henry added his initials and closed the folder. "That's it," he said. "By the time they come back, this house won't be anywhere near your name, and they won't be able to touch it." I thanked him and stepped outside into the warm light. There wasn't wind that day. The air felt still, like it was holding its breath. The formal transfer went through the following morning. County records updated by noon. The buyer, an older woman with calm eyes and a gray scarf tucked neatly at her collar, signed without questions. She nodded once when we met, said thank you softly, and left with the papers in hand. By evening, I was back on the porch, sitting in the same chair I always used, watching the same wind chimes move gently under the eaves. Nothing around me had changed. Not the roses. Not the porch rail. Not the color of the sky. But everything beneath the surface was different now. 2 days later they came. It was early. Too early for Sunday calls. I was already dressed, already seated on the porch with a fresh cup of tea when the sound of engines echoed up the drive. A moving truck came first, large white, already rumbling toward the house. Then Brent's old pickup. Then Lauren's silver SUV. They didn't bother parking neatly, just pulled in fast and climbed out. Lauren was first up the steps. She carried a clipboard and wore the kind of expression people put on when they've convinced themselves everything's under control. Brent followed behind jaw-tight sunglasses still on, even though the morning was overcast. "Mother," she said sharply, "you weren't answering your phone." "I know." Brent didn't say anything. His arms were folded. The movers were already starting to unload the dollies from the back of the truck. "We've arranged everything," Lauren continued. "You'll be moved to St. Joseph's this afternoon. The staff is ready. They've prepared a room, and the truck will be loaded by lunch." I didn't respond right away. I set my tea down on the side table and stood. "No one is moving me," I said evenly. "You're trespassing." Brent let out a short laugh. "Evelyn, don't do this. The house is already under contract. You're out of options. That's where you're wrong." I reached behind me and picked up the manila envelope from the table. I handed it to Lauren. She didn't take it at first. I waited until she did. "This is the notarized deed of sale," I said calmly. "Fully filed and recorded. As of last week, this house no longer belongs to me personally. It belongs to a private trust held by an LLC. I remain a tenant here for the rest of my life." She opened the envelope, eyes darting over the pages. Her hands began to tremble. No, you can't do this. You had a plan," I said. "You never had an agreement." Brent stepped forward, his voice rising. "This is fraud. You're not mentally competent to make these decisions." I met his gaze. "You'll have a hard time proving that, especially after your visit last week." "What visit? The one you gave so generously on camera? Every word recorded, every threat, every accusation." He took another step toward me, face reddening. "You set me up." "No," I said softly. "You revealed yourself." The movers had stopped. They stood near the truck, watching. No one touched a box. No one crossed the porch line. Then another car pulled into the driveway. It wasn't a sheriff's car. It wasn't the police. It was Daniel. He stepped out in a gray jacket, briefcase in hand, walking up the path like he'd been here 100 times. Lauren's shoulders dropped when she saw him. Brent's jaw locked. "You brought your lawyer," Brent snapped. "No," I said. "My lawyer has always been here. You're the ones late to the game." Daniel stood next to me and opened his case. He pulled out a thin folder and held it open. "Mr. Connolly," he said. "Calm as ever, your attempt to seize Miss Whitaker's assets through forged documentation and fraudulent access requests has been documented in full. We have your forged power of attorney from the bank. We have surveillance footage from inside the home. And we have your verbal threats recorded clearly." Brent didn't speak. Daniel continued. "You are in violation of multiple state and federal laws. This property no longer belongs to Miss Whitaker. Any further attempt to access it, occupy it, or manipulate its ownership will be considered criminal trespassing." Lauren had gone quiet. She held the folder in both hands like it might keep her steady. Brent's mouth opened once, then closed again. They hadn't expected this. They hadn't prepared for the door to close before they reached it. From the corner of the yard, another sound joined the moment. The slow approach of a patrol car. The patrol car eased up the driveway like it had been expected all along. The sound of gravel under the tires was steady, unhurried. Brent's head snapped toward it, then back to me, eyes wide. 2 deputies stepped out. Calm. Professional. Not rushed, not aggressive. Just solid and sure, like they'd done this 100 times before. One of them gave me a small nod. "Miss Whitaker, afternoon." Daniel took a step forward beside me, briefcase still in hand. "We filed the complaint earlier this week," he said, "based on the forged power of attorney and the trespassing threat. You should have everything." The deputy gave a quiet nod. "We do." Brent turned toward me, his voice rising now. "You called the police on your own family. I didn't move." "No. My attorney did. Before you ever got here." The second deputy stepped closer. "Sir, we're going to need you to turn around and place your hands behind your back." Lauren stepped in, then panic sharp in her voice. "Brent, just do what they say." He hesitated, jaw tight, like he was trying to think his way out of the moment. Then slowly, without a word, he turned. The cuffs clicked. The deputies read his rights while the movers stood frozen at the edge of the driveway, dollies still loaded, unsure what to do with themselves. I watched Brent walk toward the patrol car, his shoulders stiff, his steps clipped. He didn't say anything else. The door shut behind him with a solid thud, and the car pulled away slow and even until the sound of tires faded down the street. Lauren stood alone near the steps, holding the clipboard like it could anchor her. Her face was pale, her eyes searching mine for something explanation maybe, or forgiveness. I offered neither. Daniel turned to me. "It's done." I let out a breath, quiet and full. "No," I said, "it's just beginning." He gave a nod, closed his briefcase, and stepped back down toward his car. The movers began quietly closing the truck doors. No one said a word. One of them nodded at me as he passed. Respectful. Uncertain. Lauren didn't move for a long time. When she finally spoke, her voice was thin, cracked around the edges. "You didn't have to do this." I stepped down from the porch, walked slowly toward her. "You could have come to me," she said. "We could have talked it out." I met her eyes. "You weren't looking for a conversation, Lauren. You had a plan. You had it set before you even knocked on my door." She looked down at her shoes, then back at me. "Brent." He got in too deep. The cards, the loans. "We thought we had more time. We were just trying to fix it." "You were trying to fix it by tearing apart everything I built," I said. "You weren't trying to help me. You were trying to use me." Her eyes welled up, but she didn't look away. "You don't know what it's been like." "No, Lauren, you don't know what it's been like. Sitting in this house while my daughter walks through with strangers. Having my name forged. Listening to you talk about moving me out like I was furniture." She shook her head, her voice low. "I never wanted it to get this far. But it did. Because you let it." We stood there for a while, just the two of us. No more trucks, no more shouting. Then she said something I didn't expect. "I lost everything today." I looked at her steady. "No, you lost what you never had. This house was never yours to take. My trust was never yours to spend. You still have your name. You still have your freedom. Brent may not." Her lip trembled, and she looked away. Daniel returned a few minutes later, standing quietly beside me while Lauren gathered herself. "I'll need to follow up with the sheriff's office this evening," he said. "The prosecutor may call you directly. You've done everything right so far. Just stay the course." "I will." Lauren turned at the sound of his voice. "You're really not going to change your mind?" I didn't answer right away. I walked back up the steps, stopping at the door. Then I looked over my shoulder. Yes, you did, I said. You just never thought I'd say no. She stayed there, on the lawn arms, folded across her chest, staring at the space where the trucks had been. I opened the door, stepped inside, and closed it gently behind me. The lock clicked softly. I stood there in the hallway for a moment, just listening. The wind outside was steady, the floor beneath my feet solid. I wasn't afraid of silence anymore. The first hearing was held 2 weeks later in a plain, beige courtroom with flickering lights and a clock that ticked a little too loudly. I sat at the front beside Daniel, hands folded in my lap, while Brent stood with his new attorney on the opposite side. Lauren wasn't there. Her name was mentioned only once quietly as someone under investigation, but not yet charged. The judge wore glasses and didn't smile. He moved briskly through the docket until our case came up. Brent's lawyer tried to argue it was all a misunderstanding, that Brent had acted out of concern for me, that his actions had been misinterpreted. Daniel didn't say much. He simply handed over the forged power of attorney, the voicemail recordings, the document trail from the bank, and the signed complaint I'd filed. The judge flipped through the pages, reading in silence. Then he looked up. Forgery of legal documents intended to transfer ownership of a residence from a living party without consent is not a misunderstanding, he said. That's fraud. Brent didn't look at me. Not once. The judge set a formal trial date for the following month and denied Brent's request for bail to be lifted. The deputy led him out in cuffs again, and I watched the door swing closed behind them without feeling much of anything. Just stillness. Daniel leaned toward me. You did everything right. He's going to face this now, all of it. Back at the house, things stayed quiet. Lauren didn't call. She didn't show up either. A few days after the hearing, a letter arrived from a lawyer representing her. It wasn't aggressive, just a formal withdrawal of any claim to the property, and a signed statement that she was not pursuing any stake in the estate or house. There was a line near the bottom that caught my eye. My client acknowledges her actions were inappropriate and regrets any distress caused. I folded the letter carefully and slid it into the same folder where I kept all the other documents from the last few months. I didn't feel triumphant. I just felt tired. But something else happened that week, something small, but it stayed with me. A neighbor down the street, Marianne, who I hadn't spoken to much since Henry passed, rang the doorbell one morning. She had a plate of blueberry muffins in her hands and a cautious smile. I heard about the mess, she said softly. Just wanted to say, I'm glad you're still here. I invited her in. We sat in the sunroom where Henry used to read the paper and talked for nearly 2 hours. About gardens, about church, about nothing urgent. When she left, she hugged me tightly and said, You've always been one of the good ones, Linda. I hate that they tried to take that from you. The next week, I heard from Daniel again. He'd filed a civil suit on my behalf for damages, financial and emotional, stemming from the forged documents and the attempted illegal sale of my home. It wasn't about the money, he said. It was about the record, making sure what Brent did didn't just disappear under some settlement. I agreed. The final court hearing was quiet. No jury. Just the judge, Daniel, me and Brent with his shoulders hunched and his voice barely above a whisper when he spoke. The court ordered Brent to pay restitution, a significant amount, and barred him from coming within 500 feet of my property. He was also sentenced to 18 months in county jail with credit for time served. There were no cameras, no reporters. Just the gavel, the ruling, and a long hallway with echoing footsteps as he was led away again. Outside, I stood on the courthouse steps for a moment before heading back to Daniel's car. You all right? He asked. I nodded. I will be. That evening, I stood in the kitchen making tea. The radio was on low, playing some old country tune Henry used to hum along with. The sun filtered through the curtains in long golden streaks across the tile. I walked through the house, slowly touching the backs of chairs, the edge of the piano, the picture frame near the stairs. Everything was still here, every corner, every breath of it. And it was mine again. The weeks after the final hearing passed in a quiet I hadn't known in years. No phone calls from Brent. No visits from Lauren. The silence, once so heavy now, felt like a kind of peace. I could tend to my hydrangeas again without worrying about footsteps coming up the drive. I could sit with a crossword and a glass of iced tea and not feel the weight of someone else's decisions pressing against my chest. Rachel stopped by more often after that, not to check in, but just to talk. She brought over books she thought I'd like, and sometimes we sat in the living room with a puzzle between us, listening to the birds outside. One afternoon, as we worked the edge pieces into place, she looked up and said, "You've held on to more than most people ever could, Linda." I didn't know how to answer that, but I reached for her hand, and we sat there, no words needed. Daniel wrapped up the civil case paperwork that month. The settlement funds were placed in an account under my name alone, managed through his office, until I chose what to do with them. I hadn't decided yet. I wasn't in a rush. What mattered was that my name and Henry's were still on the deed, untouched. Sometimes I'd find myself standing in the hallway, looking at the framed photo of Henry in his gardening hat, squinting into the sun. I'd whisper, "We're all right now," just under my breath, like he could still hear me from wherever he'd gone. Maybe he could. One morning, I opened a drawer I hadn't touched since the week after the funeral. Inside was a folded list we'd written together. Ideas for renovating the guest room, planting a small vegetable garden, repainting the shutters. Things we never got around to. I took a pen from the kitchen and crossed off the first item. Then I walked out to the backyard, knelt down in the dirt, and began digging the corner plot we'd once marked with string. I didn't tell anyone about that. Not at first. It felt like a quiet promise kept between me and the life we'd built. By fall, the house felt different. Not haunted, not heavy, just lived in again. I replaced the curtains in the upstairs bedroom. I donated the old recliner Brent used to sink into. I picked up a part-time volunteer spot at the local library on Thursdays. The days didn't stretch quite so long anymore, and I began to answer the phone again, not out of obligation, but because I wanted to. One evening, Rachel called just to say her son had asked about the muffins I'd brought to Sunday school, and would I be willing to share the recipe. I laughed and told her it wasn't really mine. It was one of Henry's, from a battered card in his mother's handwriting. We talked for an hour after that. I don't pretend the hurt is gone, but it no longer owns the room, and that, I think, is what healing looks like when you're not chasing it. What I've learned, what I hope never to forget, is that holding your ground doesn't have to mean raising your voice. Sometimes it just means refusing to be erased, refusing to let someone else decide who you are or where you belong. So if you're still listening, thank you. And if you've ever had to fight quietly for what was already yours, I hope you know you're not alone. If this story meant something to you, I'd love to hear where you're listening from. And if you feel like it, share it with someone who might need a little reminder that dignity once claimed doesn't slip away. Not if you stand still and hold it close.